When you have to choose who lives and who dies, you learn that mercy and murder can look exactly the same. The canteen held maybe 3 swallows, and the desert stretched out like God's own punishment, endless and unforgiving under a sun that had forgotten mercy. Ezekiel Harrow wiped the grit from his cracked lips and studied the faces gathered around him in the shadow of the overturned stagecoach. Faces that had once been strangers, but now shared the terrible intimacy of the dying. The horses lay 30 yards away, their ribs already drawing buzzards from the colorless sky, and the broken axle that had brought them all to this moment jutted from the sand like a bone through torn flesh. He had been thinking about water for 2 days now, the way a drowning man thinks about air. Not the cool, sweet well water from his childhood farm in Kansas, but any water, muddy creek water, even the brackish stuff that pooled in cattle tanks. His tongue felt like leather in his mouth, swollen and useless, and when he tried to work up saliva, nothing came. The others looked the same, hollow-eyed and gray, their skin tight across their skulls like parchment stretched too thin. There was Magdalena Cruz, the Mexican woman who had boarded in El Paso with nothing but a worn carpetbag and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. She sat apart from the others, her dark hair pulled back severe despite the heat, one hand pressed against her belly where the child grew. Maybe 4 months along, Ezekiel figured, though the loose dress and her natural reserve made it hard to tell. She had spoken little during the journey, answering questions with nods or single words, but he had seen her watching the horizon with the intensity of someone who knew what it meant to wait for deliverance that might never come. Beside her, though not close enough to offer comfort, sat Dr. Cornelius Finch, a small man with soft hands and wire spectacles that caught the light like tiny mirrors. He had introduced himself as traveling to establish a practice in Phoenix, carrying a black medical bag that he clutched even now like a shield against the world's cruelties. The heat had turned his pale skin pink and raw, and sweat stains darkened his white shirt despite the fact that his body had little moisture left to give. He kept checking his pocket watch as if time still mattered out here, as if the scheduled arrival in Phoenix was anything more than a cruel joke now. Then there was Jeremiah Colt, though Ezekiel suspected that wasn't his real name, a man built like a hickory post with hands that bore the calluses of someone who had known hard work and harder choices. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots good leather despite their age, and he wore a Colt Navy revolver on his hip with the easy familiarity of a man who had used it. He had paid his fare in silver coins, counting them out carefully while scanning the other passengers with eyes the color of winter sky. A man running from something or toward it, Ezekiel had known enough of both types to recognize the signs. And finally there was the boy. Nathaniel, he had said his name was, maybe 17 years old, with the gangly limbs and uncertain movements of someone still growing into his body. His clothes marked him as town-raised, probably the son of a merchant or clerk, but there was steel in his jaw that spoke of deeper roots. He had been traveling alone, bound for California with dreams Ezekiel could almost taste, gold, adventure, a chance to become someone other than whoever he had been back home. Now those dreams lay scattered in the sand like everything else. The stagecoach driver and guard were 3 days dead, killed when the Apaches had hit them at dawn on the second day. The attack had been brief and brutal, over before anyone could do more than duck for cover, and when the dust settled, the driver lay sprawled across his seat with an arrow through his chest, while the guard clutched his rifle in hands that would never fire again. The Apaches had taken the mail pouches and ridden off, leaving the passengers alive either through mercy or indifference. Ezekiel wasn't sure which, and it didn't matter now. What mattered was the water. 3 swallows, maybe 4 if someone was careful. Not enough for 5 people. Not enough for even one person to make the 20 miles to Fort Desolation, where the next stage station squatted in the desert like a promise of salvation. The math was simple and cruel. Someone would die so the others might live, or they would all die together in the name of fairness. Ezekiel rolled the canteen between his palms, feeling the slight weight of the liquid inside, listening to its whisper against the metal. He had carried water across 6 territories, had seen men kill for less than what sloshed in his hands now. In Colorado, he had watched a prospector beat another man to death with a rock over the last drops in a stream bed. In Texas, he had seen a cavalry patrol turn on itself when the water ran low, leaving bodies scattered across the hardpan like broken dolls. The silence stretched between them, heavy as the heat that rose from the sand in visible waves. Dr. Finch cleared his throat, a sound like dry leaves rustling, and adjusted his spectacles. "We should discuss this rationally," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "As civilized people." Jeremiah Colt spat in the sand, though it was more dust than moisture. "Ain't nothing civilized about dying of thirst, Doc." "Nevertheless," Finch continued, dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief that had long since stopped absorbing anything, "we must make a decision based on logic, on who has the best chance of reaching help." "Logic." Magdalena spoke the word like it tasted bitter. "You mean who deserves to live?" Ezekiel studied her face, seeing past the exhaustion to something harder underneath. She had known this moment would come, had been preparing for it the way soldiers prepare for battle. Not with weapons or strategy, but with the kind of acceptance that comes only from having already lost everything that mattered. The boy Nathaniel shifted in the sand, drawing his knees up to his chest. "Maybe we should draw straws," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Make it fair." "Fair?" Jeremiah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Boy, you got a lot to learn about fair." Ezekiel felt the weight of their eyes on him, felt the burden of decision settling across his shoulders like a yoke. He was the oldest, had traveled these territories the longest, and somehow that made him responsible for choosing who lived and who died. He thought about his Sarah, buried 3 years now in a cemetery outside Abilene, and wondered what she would say about this moment. She had always been the moral compass in their marriage, the one who saw right and wrong in clear lines while he saw only the gray spaces between. The sun continued its merciless arc across the sky, and the shadows beneath the stagecoach grew shorter and offered less relief. Ezekiel could feel his body beginning the slow process of shutting down. The lightheadedness, the cramping in his legs, the way his vision seemed to tunnel at the edges. They had hours, not days, before the desert claimed them all. Dr. Finch removed his spectacles and cleaned them with shaking hands. "From a medical standpoint," he said carefully, "certain factors must be considered. Age, physical condition, the likelihood of survival." "You saying I'm too old?" Ezekiel asked, though without anger. It was simply a question, like asking about the weather. "I'm saying we must be practical." Finch replaced his glasses and looked around the group. "The woman is with child. That represents 2 lives, not 1. The young man has the strength and speed to cover ground quickly. Mr. Colt," he paused, studying the gunman's weathered features. "Mr. Colt has survival experience. And you, Doc?" Jeremiah's voice carried an edge like a blade. "What makes you worth saving?" Finch's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "I have medical training. If someone reaches Fort Desolation, they might encounter others in need of care." "Mighty convenient," Jeremiah said. Magdalena pressed her hand more firmly against her belly, and Ezekiel caught the gesture. 2 lives, the doctor had said. But what kind of life awaited a child born to a woman stranded alone in this territory? What kind of future stretched ahead for a mother with no husband, no family, no resources beyond what she carried in a worn carpet bag? The boy cleared his throat. "What if we all took just a sip?" he asked. "Shared it equally?" Ezekiel shook his head slowly. "Wouldn't be enough to keep any of us alive long enough to matter. Would just stretch out the dying, make it harder." "Then what?" Nathaniel's voice broke completely this time. "We just decide who dies?" "We already decided," Jeremiah said quietly. "The moment we got on this coach, we decided. Every choice we made brought us to this spot, to this moment. Now we got to live with it, or die with it." Ezekiel looked at each face in turn, seeing not the strangers who had shared an uncomfortable coach ride, but fellow travelers on a harder journey than any of them had imagined. The desert had stripped away their pretenses, their careful social masks, leaving only the raw truth of who they were when everything else fell away. He thought about Sarah again, about the night she died when the fever took her, despite all the doctor's remedies and all his prayers. He had held her hand as she slipped away, had felt the exact moment when her spirit left her body, and in that silence that followed, he had understood something fundamental about the nature of letting go. Sometimes love meant making the hardest choice, not the easiest one. The canteen felt heavier now. not lighter. The weight of 5 lives condensed into those few precious swallows. The mathematics of survival reduced to its cruelest equation. Ezekiel had seen enough death to know that it rarely came with dignity or ceremony. It was usually sudden, often meaningless, and always final. But this moment offered something different, the chance to choose meaning, to find dignity in decision rather than circumstance. In the distance, a dust devil danced across the hardpan, spinning sand and sage into a tiny whirlwind that lasted perhaps 30 seconds before dissolving back into the heat. Ezekiel watched it until it disappeared, thinking about the patterns that ruled both storms and lives, how forces came together, created something visible for a brief moment, then scattered back into the elements that had formed them. The sun climbed higher, and the choosing waited. Ezekiel Harrow stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and walked to the edge of their meager shade. The desert stretched in all directions, beautiful and terrible in its indifference, offering no guidance for the choice that lay before them. He had spent 43 years learning how to live, and now he had to learn how to decide who else would have that same opportunity. Behind him, he heard Dr. Finch adjusting his spectacles again, heard Magdalena's quiet breathing, heard Jeremiah checking the action on his revolver with practiced fingers. The boy Nathaniel had grown quiet, perhaps finally understanding that some problems couldn't be solved with fairness or good intentions. The canteen waited in the sand where he had set it, catching the light like a small sun. 3 swallows, maybe 4. The difference between dying today and dying tomorrow, or possibly, if God showed mercy and luck held, the difference between dying and living, but first there would be the choosing. And Ezekiel Harrow, who had spent his life avoiding hard decisions, would have to make the hardest one of all. The desert held its breath, waiting for his answer. When Ezekiel finally turned back to face the others, the canteen in his hands, he saw something that surprised him. Not desperation or fear, but a kind of quiet acceptance that spoke to the deeper currents of human nature. They had moved beyond panic into that strange realm where clarity sometimes comes with the approach of death. 20 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, I would have fought any man here for that water, would have killed for it, probably. He paused, feeling the weight of the words. But I buried my Sarah 3 years back, and I learned something standing beside her grave that I didn't expect to learn. Dr. Finch leaned forward slightly, his spectacles catching the light. What's that, Mr. Harrow? That the hardest thing about dying ain't the dying itself. It's leaving people behind to carry the weight of your choices. Ezekiel looked at Magdalena, then at the boy, then at Jeremiah's weathered features. Every person here has someone waiting for them, somewhere, someone who'll wonder what happened, who'll carry the not knowing for the rest of their days. Magdalena's hand moved protectively over her belly. Not all of us have someone waiting, she said softly. You got someone right there with you, Ezekiel replied. Someone who didn't choose to be here but is depending on the choices you make. The woman's eyes filled with tears that her body couldn't afford to shed. The baby's father died in the mines outside El Paso. I was traveling to my sister in Phoenix. She doesn't know about the child. Then she's got 2 reasons to be waiting, Ezekiel said. Jeremiah shifted in the sand, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his gun. Pretty words don't change the mathematics, Harrow. Still ain't enough water for 5 people. No, Ezekiel agreed, but maybe it's enough for the right person. Dr. Finch cleared his throat. If we're going to be rational about this, rational, Jeremiah spat again. Doc, there ain't nothing rational about this situation. We're past rational now. Then what are we? Nathaniel asked, his young voice carrying a weight it shouldn't have had to bear. Ezekiel considered the question, rolling the canteen between his palms. We're human, he said finally, and sometimes being human means making choices that don't make sense to anyone but yourself. He walked to where Magdalena sat and held out the canteen. She stared at it for a long moment, then shook her head. I cannot. You can, Ezekiel said gently, and you will. What about the rest of us? Dr. Finch's voice had risen slightly, panic beginning to crack through his careful composure. The rest of us do what we came out here to do, Jeremiah said, understanding flickering in his winter-pale eyes. We finish our business. The boy looked confused. What business? Jeremiah stood slowly, his hand moving to his gun, but not drawing it. My business with you, Doc. Dr. Finch went very still. I don't understand. Sure you do. Jeremiah's voice was calm, conversational. You understand perfectly, just like you understood when you walked out of that hospital in Denver after little Mary Colt died on your operating table. Remember Mary, Doc? 8 years old, sweet as spring water, and you were drunk when they brought her in with the appendicitis. The color drained from Finch's already pale face. That was, the operation was complicated. The operation was simple. What was complicated was doing it with hands that shook from too much whiskey. Jeremiah took a step closer, his shadow falling across the doctor's trembling form. What was complicated was explaining to my brother why his daughter died because the only doctor in town couldn't stay sober long enough to save her. Nathaniel scrambled backward in the sand. Jesus. Your brother? Finch whispered. My brother Marcus, Mary's daddy. He ate his gun 2 months after we buried her. Couldn't live with the grief. Jeremiah's voice remained steady, matter of fact. Left me to explain to his wife why she'd lost both a husband and a daughter because one man couldn't put down a bottle. Ezekiel felt something shift in the air around them, like the pressure changed before a storm. The desert had become a courtroom, and they were all witnesses to a justice that had followed them across hundreds of miles of hardpan and sage. That's why you were on the stagecoach, he said to Jeremiah. You weren't running from something. You were running toward it. Been tracking him for 8 months, Jeremiah confirmed. From Denver to Santa Fe to El Paso, always one step behind, until I heard he'd booked passage to Phoenix. Figured to settle accounts there, but he gestured at the broken stagecoach, the endless desert. Desert had other plans. Dr. Finch fumbled for his medical bag, clutching it against his chest like armor. I've changed, he said desperately. I don't drink anymore. I've been sober for months. I'm trying to make amends to help people. Help people. Jeremiah's laugh was as dry as the desert wind. Like you helped Mary. Magdalena watched the exchange with dark eyes that held no judgment, only the weary recognition of someone who had seen too much pain to be surprised by more. The boy looked back and forth between the two men, his face pale beneath the sunburn. So what now? Nathaniel asked. You shoot him here in the desert? Don't see much point in that, Jeremiah replied. Desert's gonna do the job for me. Justice is justice, whether it comes from a bullet or from thirst. Ezekiel held the canteen out to Magdalena again. Take it, he said softly. For the child. She looked at him with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of generations. And you? All of you? We make our peace with what comes next, Ezekiel said, each in our own way. Dr. Finch made a choking sound, half sob and half laugh. Peace? You call this peace? I call it finished business, Jeremiah said. Been carrying this weight for 8 months, Doc. Time to set it down. Magdalena took the canteen with trembling hands, unscrewed the cap, and took a careful sip. The water seemed to restore some color to her face, some life to her eyes. She offered it back to Ezekiel, but he shook his head. That's yours now, he said. And the little ones. You save what you can, walk when the sun goes down, follow the wagon tracks north. Fort Desolation's maybe 15 miles. You can make it. What about you? Ezekiel settled back against the side of the stagecoach, feeling a strange peace settle over him like a blanket. I'm gonna sit here and think about my Sarah. Been too long since I gave her the attention she deserved. Jeremiah had taken a seat in the sand, his gun across his knees but no longer threatening. Reckon I'll do some thinking too, about Mary and Marcus and all the roads that led to this place. Dr. Finch was crying now, silent tears that carved clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, he whispered. None of us did, Ezekiel replied, but here we are all the same. The boy looked around at the 3 men, his face struggling to process what he was seeing. This isn't right, he said. This isn't how things are supposed to work. How are things supposed to work? Jeremiah asked gently. Nathaniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came. That's the first smart thing you've figured out since we left El Paso, Jeremiah said. Some things don't have answers, boy. Some things just are. The sun continued its climb toward zenith, and the heat began to shimmer off the sand in waves that made the horizon dance. Magdalena capped the canteen and secured it in her carpet bag, then moved to gather what little shade she could find on the other side of the stagecoach. "Ma'am," Ezekiel called to her, "when you reach Fort Desolation, when they ask you what happened here, what will you tell them?" She considered the question for a long moment. "I will tell them that men faced a hard choice and chose to be human," she said. "I will tell them that some debts can only be paid in the desert, and that mercy sometimes wears the face of justice." Dr. Finch looked up at her through his tears. "Will you tell them I was sorry?" "I will tell them you died with your medicine bag in your hands," she replied. "The rest is between you and God." The afternoon stretched ahead of them, long and merciless, but somehow Ezekiel found that he wasn't afraid. He thought about Sarah, about the way she used to hum while she worked in their garden, about the sound of her laughter when he told stories around their evening fire. He thought about the choices that had brought him to this desert, this moment, these companions in the face of ending. Beside him, Jeremiah had closed his eyes and was speaking quietly to himself, words that might have been prayers or memories or both. Dr. Finch sat with his head in his hands, his medical bag open beside him as if he might still find some remedy for what ailed them all. And the boy Nathaniel sat staring at the horizon with the look of someone seeing the world clearly for the first time, understanding finally that dreams and desert sand were not the same thing, that some lessons could only be learned at the edge of everything. The desert waited, patient as death itself, while 5 lives approached their separate endings in the shade of a broken stagecoach. But in that waiting, in that choosing, in that final act of human will against an indifferent universe, something important had been preserved, something that mattered more than survival, more than fairness, more than the simple mathematics of who lived and who died. Something like grace, hard-won and desert-tested, rising from the sand like heat waves, shimmering and true. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.